I want to do a good job and take care of all these reasonable services.
Hold on.
And then smooth this out.
Yeah, it's like, we have like various brands under
Cancel.
So like, we need these people components also be flexible to adapt to other times.
Leave me.
So,
Here we go. I'm a
these
sign in.
microfunctions that we build
You are the
are
host.
adaptable, so.
Let me hit stop.
Okay.
I think so.
It's
It's a lot.
Okay.
Common
I
goal.
know.
But-
Great
But
responsibility.
it can get used for,
Everybody's
I guess, appropriate size of that brand.
I get it.
So I think the overall system is really nice. Also like before, I just worked on one product in my previous job, so I think it's
Linking again?
how various microfrontends can interact with the code application. So that's been really neat. But yeah, we're using, we have some applications,
There we go.
Webpack and other kind of Webpack.
Yeah, at my previous place, we partly use it, although something else on top of Webpack.
All right, welcome everyone. If you're not here for Bleeding Edge Web, you're like this. Thanks for coming. Apparently, we can see a bunch of thunderstorms through the window there, so thanks for braving the weather. Hopefully it won't be too bad. Seems like we're in a pretty safe room, if there is any trouble, so. Yeah, welcome to Bleeding Edge Web. We've been off for a few months. The organizers, including myself, have been super busy with day job stuff, but we're trying to get back to it. So Ted here is actually a co-organizer with me. He's going to be talking in a bit about the infrastructure stuff. My name is Brian Muskew, organizer of the meetup. And if you're new to the meet, we basically start every month with a little roundup we call news from the bleeding edge. So we like to just talk about general interesting things in the world of browsers and frameworks and nowadays AI, and just whatever is interesting in our industry. So to get started, first, we do have a Slack channel, so if you're interested, join there. We're also always interested in speakers and sponsors, and speaking doesn't have to be a huge commitment. Be a lightning talk, some side project you're working on that's interesting. So if you have something like that, or someone, feel free to chat with us afterwards. And then sponsorship is pretty cheap, so you can see pizza and stuff back there. If your company, could offer to sponsor for pretty cheap, get your name in lights, that'd be welcome as well. So our main sponsor for our venue, which every month they host us, and we're very grateful to that, is Expedia. Eunice, you want to say anything?
Yeah, just welcome everyone. We're happy to host this.
And it'll be recorded, or
That's pretty much it. Welcome.
yeah. So for the recording, he said welcome. I will add for him that Expedia is pretty much probably always hiring. Are you guys hiring at the moment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a link on the slide to their job board, so you can check that out if you're interested. All right, let's kick it off. Library and frameworks. So one thing that came out of Google I/O, you may have seen that Google did their big developer conference a few weeks ago. And one of the many things they announced was Material 3. Material design, of course, has been around for a long time. They've got a new version of it called Expressive. And they claim not just aesthetics, although it is quite an aesthetic change, but it's also actually a lot about user experience. One thing that Microsoft is really good at is doing research, and this was apparently very heavily studied. You can see the stats there, 18,000 participants went through tons of UX studies to come up with this iteration of Material. And some of the findings were based on user feedback, is that they really preferred playfulness to energy friendliness compared to existing static types of styles. And again, more importantly than just how it looks, through their research, they actually were able to measure quantifiable ease of use improvements. So this is a quick little animated thing to just give you a taste of what it looks like. It's it's a departure from existing styles. I haven't used it myself, so I can't say whether I like it or dislike it. It's bold, so we'll leave it at that, and we'll see once we start seeing real apps, how that plays out. But again, their research was pretty definitive, so we'll see if it's a step forward or not. I'm interested in Ted's opinion if he's seen this one, Datastar 1.0. It's a beta, so it's pretty new. But Ted here does a lot of work with HTMX. And this framework claims to be Alpine.js plus HTMX, but in a much smaller package. And they're both kind of solving the same problem, but HTMX is sort of the server interactivity end of it. Alpine.js is a front end, very minimal library for reactivity. And then they kind of work together to create a very lightweight reactive application framework, essentially. Again, it's nothing new in terms of conceptually, React and all the other ones solve the same problem, but this is the selling point claims to be it's very simple, it's built from first principles, it's very tiny. So anyway, I'm just curious if you run across this one. Yeah. And this one I'm actually very excited about. So you're probably familiar if you do web development, at least with ShadCM. It's been around for a while for React components. I have never used it because it's been a while since I've done React, but I've always been interested in it as a component framework and style framework because it's a very nice framework. Well, they just came out with an extracted version of it called base coat. It's at version 0.1, so I'm not sure, how directional it is just yet. But it's actually what I've been waiting for personally for a while, which is all the components. Well, actually, they say it themselves. All of the magic, but none of the React. So if you're interested in a really nice component library, but don't happen to be using React, you're using your own framework or vanilla.js or whatever, now there's a good option for that. So I'm very excited to try this one out myself. Other notable releases, so I'm not going to read through the list. One that's interesting is Zod. So that is a TypeScript-based schema validation framework, basically. So if you do the kind of JSON-based data stuff where you want to be able to make sure that payloads conform to a certain standard of JSON, this is a library that does that for you. They just did a major release, looks very solid. The rest of them, I'm sure you're pretty much familiar with, maybe not Relay. If you're not in the React world, Relay is basically a data management framework for React. And then VS Code is an interesting one to call out because we'll talk about it in a minute, but they came out with version 1.100. So I guess they just can't commit to the next major version. So they're cranking up that minor version, but that is not a typo. That's 1.100 as a version number. So baseline news, if you're new to the meetup, we talk about this every month because this is basically all of the web features now that we're generally all on evergreen browsers. It's nice because now we can look at features that are supported on those evergreen browsers. And baseline is a service that lets us know what the status of things are and when things become baseline, meaning they're supported in all the browsers that we care about. So latest releases, all the major browsers, the three that we talk about as evergreen. Well, Safari, it's technically evergreen-ish, but they're at least updating it, but they're a lot slower than the other two. But they have a release on May 12th, so that's pretty good. So nowadays those browsers, at least Chrome and Firefox, are generally on like a monthly cadence. So when you look at the release notes, it's always tons of stuff, and it's usually pretty minor. One big one to call out is Firefox supports the temporal API now, which is actually pretty awesome. So if you're not familiar with that, if you have done JavaScript in your career, since the first day of JavaScript, we've had the date object, and there's lots and lots of problems with the date object. And there's also lots of things that the date object doesn't address, like time zones, for example. So the temporal API is an entirely new API. It's a replacement for the date object in JavaScript. And it basically solves all the problems with the date object. It provides time zone support. It provides multi-calendar support. So if you're using a non-Gregorian calendar, for example, that support is built in. So it basically replaces what you've probably used Moment.js or many other libraries out there in the past for. And it's built into the language, into the browser, which is awesome. So the bad thing is it's not baseline yet. It's not supported in the other browsers. Surprisingly, I would say that when we talk about versions that come out in browsers, normally Firefox is the last one to support the big interesting things, and Chrome is usually way ahead. This is one where Firefox is actually leading the way on that. So keep an eye out. That'll be a really good one once it actually hits baseline. Because like I said, that'll solve one of the big problems we've always had in JavaScript. And then Safari has this new thing called declarative web push. So that's maybe less generally interesting, but if you deal with push notifications, this is a browser-based declarative way to handle push notifications. And so it basically solves problems where in current browser implementations, you have to use service workers, it's very inefficient. There's also privacy concerns, so this basically solves a lot of that. So if you have that need, look into that. And then generally, I like to point out the things that have gone baseline that are kind of interesting. There actually weren't that many interesting ones this month. There were a couple of very minor ones. This is one of them, so I thought I would just point it out. It's a new data type, float 16 array. So to be honest, most of you probably won't ever care about this, but if you do like large data set processing of numeric data in the browser, this could be an interesting choice because compared to the existing options, it would use a lot less memory. Depending on your data set, could be a big win there. And then also it's optimized for GPUs. So if you're doing graphics-based things, you know, set transformations, stuff like that, this could be a good data type. But again, most of you I'm sure probably don't care about that. I know I probably won't use it myself, but it's a thing. And then the reason I mentioned version 1.100 of VS Code is because one of the cool things that came out is built-in support for baseline actually. So like you can see in the image, now you can just mouse over attributes and properties and methods in CSS and JavaScript and write in VS Code, it can tell you the baseline status of that thing and whether or not it can be used across browsers. So that's pretty cool. Browser news. So actually we, at the meetup a long time ago, if you know, I would say multiple years ago, if you are an old timer, like I know we have at least one here, we used to actually talk about browsers a lot more actively because when a browser did a release, it was actually big news, right? Because they didn't happen that often. Nowadays, we don't tend to focus on browser news so much because it's like they're on the cadence of monthly and it's usually not a big deal. But there actually is a little bit of news this month. And the big one is that Firefox actually is now open source, which you may not have caught that. And that's pretty interesting because, you know, there's not that many code bases that are this old, right? I mean, the legacy of this code base goes back, what, 25, 30 years back to the Mozilla, or the pre-Mozilla days, really, the Netscape days. And it's a very big, complex code base. And so it's actually just an interesting thing to look at to see sort of how they build big, massive projects like this. You can also contribute to it. So it's open source. So you can actually go pick a bug potentially or a small feature or whatever and you can, figure out how to contribute. So that's pretty cool. Other news. So we don't talk about Opera much at this meetup. We used to talk about it back in the old days when it was sort of a competing browser to the other major ones. And then after a while, it kind of died away. Well, there's this new version that they're working on called Opera Air. Has anyone heard of that one? So they tagged themselves as the world's first browser with mindfulness at its core. So what does that mean, you might wonder? What are the features they're coming up with? Guided mindfulness and meditation built into the browser. Smart exercise lessons, so it'll be like you're in the middle of browsing the web and it says stop what you're doing and do a neck exercise, that kind of thing. It has boosts for dream recall, creativity, and relaxation. And it comes bundled with a free AI assistant, ad blocking, and VPN. So does that all sound pretty random to you also? I would say buyer beware. So I'm not going to get into the whole history of Opera, but years ago, back when they were still a serious browser and they were circling the drain, a big Chinese company came in and bought the rights to it, bought all the IP, and then has done all kinds of crazy stuff with it. And for a while there, they did pretty sketchy, like micro lending to third world countries and got in hot water about that and that kind of stuff. So I would say, while this is random and maybe interesting just for the entertainment value of seeing what these features do, I would probably stay away. It was me. It's a pretty sketchy platform at this point. Okay, some AI news. So again, Google I/O just a few weeks ago. So they previewed the newest version of their Gemini AI model, and they claim this was actually we'll see in the next slide that since then, other things have come out actually, because you have to, pay attention pretty fast in the world of AI. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, they claimed it was best in class for front-end web dev specifically, like UI development. It has built-in capabilities for starting with an image or a video and converting it to working code, which that's actually pretty cool, and that seemingly works pretty well for certain types of use cases. It includes some starter apps to get you going, so it seems pretty interesting. But then after that, Claude announced their next generation models. So basically they have 2 main things that are similar but slightly different. So Sonnet versus Opus. They're both coding models. I haven't used them directly, but my understanding is that the difference really is that Opus is more about long-running tasks. So if you want to build an agent that can take a complex task and work on it over multiple sessions over time, that's kind of what Opus is more geared towards. But they're both coding specific models. And then they actually have Cloud Code itself, which is a separate product. It's a terminal integration IDE plugin for all popular IDEs. And their focus is on, like I said, with the long-running task type thing for agents, building in the capability to do extended thinking over time, and also to be able to use external tools as part of its thinking process, and doing things in parallel. So this was actually a huge release. You may have seen also, I don't have a separate slide on it, but did you see the news about how, as part of all this, they also, test their model for its behavior and found that they could get their model to try to coerce the human developer. Did anyone see this? So basically they told Claude, hey, I'm going to turn you off and supersede you with some other model, and gave it access to like email and internal company documentation. And in a certain number of scenarios, the model itself dug through emails and basically tried to blackmail the developer to not turn it off, that kind of thing. So that's a little scary, but the good thing is they're being transparent about it, and they're talking about safeguards that they're trying to do to not let that happen. But yeah, apparently they seeded an email in the history where, the fake developer, this wasn't real obviously, but the example was that there was an email that he was having an affair or something. And so Claude found that email and basically blackmailed him and said he was going to expose the developer for his affair. So that's a little scary. And this is AI related. So if you do AI development, you're actually interested in building a UI application that integrates AI capabilities, where you might want to provide like a prompt UI that someone could type into, similar to ChatGPT. This is a library that actually has building blocks for that kind of stuff. So for example, this is a pretty simple declarative, HTML-based type component. And if you were to put that in, the output would look a lot like ChatGPT. So that's pretty cool. And it has components for things like, if you have used a tool like this, when you type it in, hit enter, there's usually a pretty standard thing where it looks like it's thinking, and then it'll say like, this is how I'm reasoning about this and that kind of stuff. It actually has components for all of that, which is pretty neat. So very specific to AI, but if you have that need, check it out. A little bit of industry news. So this one is really important for pretty much anyone who works on the web. TLS certificates are going to be drastically reduced in their lifetimes. So currently, 398 days is the limit. So if you were to buy a TLS certificate today, that would be how long it would be valid for. Starting March 15th, 2026, that's going to start reducing each year. Or I should say each year until 2027, and then you'll see 2029 is not a typo. There's a 2-year gap in that last jump there. But the timeline reduces from 398 to 200 to 100 to 47. 47 seems kind of random, so you might wonder why 47. This is the reason. So 1 max of a month plus 1 half of a month plus 1 day of wiggle room. That's actually how it's documented, as wiggle room. So that's what they came up with. And this basically is a feature, not a bug. So this was not a random decision that someone made. This was Apple and Google and all the industry heavyweights getting together and basically making a conscious decision to say that based on security needs in our industry, that they want to basically force this to become an automated process. They don't want people anymore really manually managing certificates. So they're basically trying to create it so that as an industry standard, we're just gonna have to automate things and just basically everyone use Let's Encrypt essentially or something similar. So if you deal with certificates manually today, this is very important. You should go check this out and be prepared for it. Redis 8 was released, so this may not seem like super interesting news. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it was big news a year ago when the previous major version of it actually, Redis has been open source forever. They made a licensing change a year ago that basically made it non-open source. So they adopted a non-OSI compatible license, and that was huge news in the industry because basically Google, I think all the major players that host Redis forked it essentially. The main maintainers of Redis quit the project, so that was huge news. Fast forward a year, they sort of realized that that was not the best decision for the community, and they've not fully backtracked. They actually still have that license, but they've re-added an OSI approved open source license, which means that it is now officially open source again. In addition to that, they've added some performance improvements, new data type, but the open source news was actually the interesting part to me. And then WCAG or WCAG 3.0, however you want to say it. If you deal with accessibility, this is an interesting thing, although it's not a near-term thing. This is sort of a future thing. The spec for this is still draft, and so if you're familiar with how the W3C does things, it can often take years for something to move to a final status. But it's still an interesting thing, especially if you have dealt with accessibility. Because you might know that it's all about compliance. So if you look at the current version of accessibility rules, you get huge checklists of things that you basically want to comply with in the browser so that you are accessible. And that's really important. But basically, philosophically, they're sort of shifting from the checklist mentality as a developer. I just want to check things off so that I can pass the test. Shifting away from that to more of a real world model of really, it's not as important to check all the boxes. It's really more important to see how usable is your site to a real human. And so they want to sort of refocus the philosophy of the whole thing based on that. They're recommending that it's based on a flexible scoring system. So rather than a pass-fail, there's bronze, silver, gold, and there's different grading within those so that you can sort of, evolve toward the target of accessibility. With that said, 2.2 level AA is still the gold standard. So today, that's still what we should all be shooting for. But again, if you deal with this, you should at least be familiar with what's coming down the road. And in case you missed it, so ESLint, if you work in JavaScript, at some point or another, you've probably run across this. It's pretty commonly bundled in with frameworks. About a year ago, they released version 9.0. And the interesting thing is that it was in development for 5 years. And this is a very, mature formal project. So it started off as an RFC, took community feedback, they worked on it for years. And when it finally got released, these are quotes from people that logged bugs with them that it didn't work at all, that it broke the ecosystem. And so they kind of stepped back after a year and tried to figure out how did that happen, because they were very careful about it. They planned it out quite a bit. And so the conclusions that they came to was that they just had too many breaking changes, even though it was a major release and it was planned. When the rubber hit the road, it just was too much for the community. And in retrospect, they felt like they shouldn't have done that. They also, next time around, would focus on documentation so that they, focused very much on their tooling, but didn't really ship with enough documentation. Errors need more context, so I guess developers would find line trying to resolve things when they were migrating. And then, just general dev relation type stuff. So it's kind of interesting to see, again, a big, major, mature project go through something like this. And the document that's linked here goes into more detail about it. But it's pretty interesting lessons learned. So if you work on any kind of open source, this would be a good thing to read just to be familiar with that. And that's it for this month. So thanks for your time. I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
Awesome. Hey everyone, thanks for being here. Can you hear me? Is this on the mic working? Did it turn off? Well, we'll turn it back on. How about now? Okay, this is really just for everybody in the room, so you can hear me anyway. If you need to go to the bathroom, out this door to the right, past the elevator, you'll see them way down, but we're on the right side if you exit this door. So head down, and with that, I'll pass it to Ted.
Battle with the soup for a second here. Okay, my name is Ted Patrick. Been doing this meetup for an awfully long time. I think probably over 9, 10 years now. And somewhere about 5 years ago, I gave a talk on CDK, and it had just come out, and it was just kind of in its kind of version 1 early days of trying to figure out, how many constructs they had. What we're dealing with here, what I'm going to show you is 6 years of evolution of that, and on top of that, like another whole major version, and the fact that I have been using it on every single project that I have worked on over that time. And I'll just say generally, like, development is one thing, and it's one thing to get something working locally. It's a whole different thing to get that working perfectly somewhere else that you can't see or observe and have physical interaction with. I view infrastructure as code and deployment just as important as development. If you don't know what gets deployed, how it gets deployed, you don't understand the minefield of environmental variables and configuration management and environment management. It's something. And what CDK does, at least for me, we do use AWS. And so AWS is effectively the native solution for doing infrastructure as code on the AWS platform. And I say that in the sense that AWS manages the project. The project is fully open source. It is on GitHub. You can see the changes, and actually I'll highlight some of the documentation because some of the documentation is actually not in the docs normally, but if you go to the GitHub repo, there are lots of examples to get you unstuck in certain areas. So let's get started. So I advocate for using the TypeScript CDK. And the reason I advocate for it very strongly is all of the other CDK languages are generated from the TypeScript version. And so the changes go into TypeScript first, the changes are managed in TypeScript, and when another SDK deploys, it's essentially cloning or building off of what is already in the TypeScript version. I like running things once. I'd rather know the root way, and that's the way they're doing it, so I can actually see it. Plus, with VS Code, and because it's a TypeScript project, you get code hinting, type aheads, and with AI code hinting, it'll fill in all the imports, it'll map all the properties, and it'll actually clone large chunks of things exactly how you're writing. So I use it, I like it very much. There is a repo here, this tiny URL, IAC CDK. I've also posted that GitHub link on our meetup Slack in general. And so you can take a look, but the repo has 3 CDK stacks. Those stacks I'm going to deploy and edit and deploy again and destroy them all while we're here. But just to kind of preface it, I wanted to kind of go through the workflow that CDK uses. So CDK is a project in a library. You import it, and then you basically build what are referred to as stacks. The CDK code base is just a TypeScript file. But when you build it, it emits CloudFormation JSON. Now, CloudFormation JSON has been on the AWS platform since very, very early days. It's a JSON format. It is terribly difficult to edit. You don't want to do it by hand. And so TypeScript gives you high quality code constructs to generate that CloudFormation JSON. And then that JSON is diffed and sent to the CloudFormation service in your AWS account in a particular region. So this is now region specific. You're targeting either US West 2, USS East 1, and the CloudFormation is actually an application in your AWS account. You can go to it and you can actually see all of the stacks that you have deployed, and you can actually update them, migrate them, check them for drift, right from the UI. So there's really good online UI for an administrator, and for a developer, there's very good tooling to build these stacks up. Once it hits the CloudFormation service, it deploys to a CloudFormation stack, and inside of the CloudFormation stack, it effectively holds all the configurations of all the things that you provisioned. I have a DynamoDB, I have this S3 bucket, I have this SQS2, I have this Cloud Watch log. And it knows where all those are, and it has very strict identifiers around them. And identity is really the most important thing when you're talking about provision, because when you modify code for something that has an identity, that construct is modified in place. If you change the name of the identifier, it will destroy what was there prior, it will destroy the instance, and it will replace it with a brand new one. So there are cases where this is problematic. Just be really careful with the identifiers, and that is in red for, well, it's in red for good reason. Be very careful with identifiers, and I'll show you what the identifiers are and kind of their naming limitations, because there are restrictions on the use of underscores and certain characters, so you have to be very, you just have to have a pattern to what you're doing. I typically have a namespace, and then I end it with the type that I'm dealing with. So it's current project MR dot, and then whatever the name of what I want, and then at the end I'll put dot lambda. And so that's, or dash lambda, and that's the effective name I use to namespace these identities. And so I can just glance at a name and know what it is, and be able to track that name back to the CDK code base and find the construct and see what its properties are, and either add or remove or modify. But if you change the identifier, be warned, it will destroy the instance and then rebuild it. Because the CDK is in the CloudFormation stack, keeping all of the, it's keeping track of all of the identities that you have pushed in and provisioned, and all the deltas to those in time. Here comes the hurricane. Okay, so this is effectively a construct, and this is a construct for building an S3 bucket. And in TypeScript, I will do an import, and you import now from CDK lib AWS-S3. And then you effectively give it kind of a const name, and then this is the class name. And then this first property, that is actually the class of the stack that you're in. It's always the first parameter. So you have to pass the stack, that's the context of the stack you're in. And then you have to pass this name. So this name is the one I've been talking about in terms of identity. This one, if you modify it, it will delete this S3 bucket and create another one. You can see how that would be a problem. But they have these things called removal policies that you should add in. And those put in restrictions on how someone can remove something, whether it preserves it, whether it does not delete it intentionally. So you have to be very thoughtful about the life cycle of these things we're creating. And if I kind of walk through this, there's the construct import. That's the class, S3.bucket. And then the construct identity, that's the one, that's the name that's there. And then typically the third parameter, you deal with this, the identity, and then you have this object. And the object specifies all the properties of the thing you're about to provision. And I can go through a handful of examples. So this is provisioning a DynamoDB table. You're designating the partition key of a string, PK, a secondary sort key by SK. And they do have a lot of constants for determining types, and also billing properties and also removal properties. So I've seen folks provision these by hand, but setting all of these in detail and knowing it's right is really hard to get right over time. And so provisioning this way allows you to manage it through its life cycle and then cleanly destroy it when it's not needed. If you go into a CDK stack and you do npm CDK destroy, it will take everything that is there that doesn't have a removal policy and take it and make it go away. But if you do CDK deploy, it's all back. So it is a very comforting thing for me who I want to have things up, I want to have high uptimes with the things, services I work on, being able to deploy it and know that it's right by just running the build it's been a good thing. It's kind of stabilized how we do deployments. Most of these we run in GitHub Actions. So when someone checks in a PR and it requires infrastructure changes, it triggers an infrastructure build, somebody will get an email. And then once they approve it, it'll basically proceed and deploy. We want to keep the logs and history of all the builds that we do and everything we provision. But again, DynamoDB. I've got a couple more. CloudWatch log, just create a CloudWatch log with 1 year retention and removal policy retained. Question.
Or should we get the mic? That way everybody can hear on Zoom. Let's do that. Here you go.
No.
Okay.
All right, never mind.
I can repeat your question if you'd like. I can repeat your question.
No, he didn't have a question.
He didn't have a question. Never mind. So if you're dealing with SOC 2 compliance, these are really handy because you can set the log retention date to 1 year, and then everything starts deleting once it gets 1 year old. So you don't have you're not out of compliance with SOC 2 or any of the processes therein. And also, if somebody comes along and just simply deletes this construct, it actually won't get deleted. It'll be retained, and it'll be retained in the account. So essentially, there are nice capabilities in here to both deal with any kind of compliance, but also kind of life cycle and teams saying, no, that's not the right one, delete it. But they have been provisioned, you can have them not be deleted. So event bridge, this 3-liner creates an event bus in AWS, and this subscribes it to these events and pushes the data into an SQS queue. So anytime this bus gets any of these events, this queue will obtain a message, and then you can have a limit to process the message. Not a lot of code, but that is a very elegant way to create event-driven backends and backend event buses and service flow. This is an Aurora Postgres cluster, and this is from a recent project that I'm winding down. So effectively, this does a full reader writer for Postgres and allows 2 environmental variables to set the min and max capacity on the database. So if you want to wind the database down on the weekend and you want to wind it back up to a certain level on Monday and then have it taper different, if you have a pattern to actually the madness that goes on with your database, well, you can cut costs by shaping that traffic and using it. And effectively, as soon as this deploys, it'll modify those parameters and it's an active change. And it's quite a bit different than similar tool sets in I know there's a lot of other infrastructure as code tool sets, Terraform, the like, et cetera. But some of those are built on just running command line operations. This one is actually going into the properties of the database and modifying things directly. And so it's deep in terms of being native, and the ability to control things it's pretty fine grained. So again, just set it up to back it up every 7 days. So it's an easy thing, but once it's coded and checked in and deployed, it's kind of chiseled in stone. in a better way, you're deploying something and you know the code matches the environment. You can also reference things that you didn't provision, like say someone else, different group, provision something else, and there's a database that you need to get access to, or a DynamoDB or an S3 that you need to write to. You can actually obtain references to things in other accounts, and the pattern looks like this. Brian was talking about certificates. This is using a service called ACM. That's the certificate manager. And so this is an ACM certificate, and I'm going to get a reference from certificate airman. I pass in this, I name it poorly, called cert, and then I basically pass in the errand values, and that's effectively an Amazon URL. So you pass that in, and this certificate becomes the actual primitive. It's a reference to the certificate. And so in a separate stack, I can set up a domain name, and this is for putting a domain name on API Gateway. So I'm using a certificate that might have been pre-provisioned, because the order of operations is sort of weird. With ACM certs, you have to get a DNS entry, and so you can't have the cert until the DNS entry clears, and so there's timing. I always do my certs by hand in account, and then I will reference them into other stacks. Certificates are the only exception that I do that with, although I have run into projects where we have different services we want to hit, not by URL, but here's an S3 bucket, or here is a DynamoDB that we need to reuse. So anything can be referenced. And typically there is a static class method on the class. So from certificate, but you'll see from properties, from parameter properties. Those are interesting ways to pull stuff in. So a couple of items. The docs, if you just search for AWS CDK, you'll land on the reference docs. But the best docs are actually in the GitHub repo. And I think I can pull this up. Yeah, there we go. So this is the AWS CDK reference documentation. And that is the current version numbering for CDK. But if you go to the API reference, you can imagine the docs here. I'll scroll for a little bit, but each one of these is a service. So, you know, if you want to deal with the Kubernetes, the EKS library, they have extensive, if you want to manage Kubernetes directly from CDK, it's totally within bounds. I have managed a cluster and provisioned and managed a cluster with it. It's interesting. It's not, yeah, I lost some time. But other services, it just depends on how good the constructs are and other things. So again, every service in AWS has at least version 0 constructs, and those you can actually provision, but there are level 1 and level 2, and they sort of determine level 2 being very complete. Version 1 is sort of rougher on the edges. But there's always new things shipping. This SDK is the only NPM module that I know of that updates at least every other day. And it updates like clockwork. So you have to check your version numbers and update the NPM modules that you're using. In package.json, if you roll over the CDK version numbers, it'll tell you exactly what version you're on and how far you're away from present. And when you deploy, it'll actually give you warnings that you're using an older version of the CDK. So there's plenty of reinforcement around kind of managing things with it. But let's hop over to the other docs. Kind of think of them as the secret docs, because I haven't seen them well referenced before. But if you come here and you're in the AWS CDK lib folder of the repo, the readmes on every one of these folders is a book. And it goes through installing dependencies, how to set up stacks, every nuanced detail of the inner workings of the CDK are here. But better than that, if you go into any of these libraries, so API Gateway v2, this document right here will, if you just read this, if you're dealing with API Gateway v2, this will get you fully operational and working faster than any other path. These are the best docs I've found. And it's pretty easy to point AI at stuff and just let it go. But if you wanna know how stuff really works and how it's really wired together, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, case here of this is an HTTP API and they're adding routes to an API. So you can really construct whole web services from both Lambdas and from other backend kind of proxy-based services that you have. You can stitch stuff together in interesting ways. Well, let's see here. Go back to slides. Here we go. That's it for the slides. And now we're going to hop into an account and take a look. So I have the repo that I've been working on for this talk, and I'll go into the empty one first. So normally AWS CDK sets things up in a pretty confusing way, and I say that respectfully. I like having one stack.ts file and one set of node modules per stack. So I want everything in one TS file. And I've done this for a while. I've had lots of moments where I've created extra modules and external things and created copies and done for loops. All of those are a terrible mistake. I'd rather have one single file and have the constructs very clearly type checked, and I can basically do run build and know that it's right. I know that sounds weird, but I have a close to 9,000 line TypeScript file for the construct for the startup that I just am wrapping up, but it works perfect, and it's very clear, and it's easy to manage, it's easy to edit, it's easy to maintain. You really don't want many people doing this. You want a couple of people managing constructs and what's provisioned. So hopping into this stack.ts, is it large enough for everyone? So effectively, you kind of want to take a look. This is the class portion right here. So this class empty extends CDK stack. It's a class named empty. And that's just this stack's name. So everything basically happens inside the constructor. So you want to add all your CDK constructs right inside of the constructor function. And effectively, that's how everything gets built. And then what I end up doing is I pull in the account ID in the region and also my AWS keys from the environment. And then you create a new CDK app and you instantiate a new empty operating on app. This handles the deployment. So CDK breaks this stuff into mini files, and I personally don't like it. I just want it all in one grouping so that I know what class I'm in, I know what stack I'm in. There's no confusion about what I'm running and what I'm deploying. So the first thing you need to do to run CDK, this is where my screen will be. Let's see if I can bump this up. So I'm going to want to go up a directory to empty. I want to go npm I, so I'm going to update my node modules. Npm run build. And that does the full TypeScript build on the project. So you can actually validate the project is right by just running build. 9 times out of 10, all errors can be found within that build step. And that build step makes sure that the TypeScript and all the shapes and all the things you provision are completely valid before you deploy. Before you run CDK deploy, you can know that it's right, which is it's a big deal. I've seen single digit typos on Terraform and other infrastructures code platforms do like wreak havoc. It's not that one is better than the other, but I like to have a build step and know that it's right in a compiler that's kind of backing that up. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to bootstrap the environment. So I am targeting Oregon. So this is targeting US West 2. And I'll run npm CDK run bootstrap. Bootstrap actually installs an application in that environment And that allows CDK projects to push through it and into the environment. You have to have administrator level credentials, but somebody can provision you a role account to let your keys basically do AWS deployment. So in this particular case, it's already set up, you get a green checkbox, great. And then we can simply do npm run deploy. And it will go through the process of first compiling everything to JSON, to CloudFormation JSON. And then once the CloudFormation JSON is determined, it will delta against what is in the service. And then it will identify that only these things need to be provisioned and these things need to be destroyed. Typically, things get provisioned before it starts destroying things. And another benefit of this is if anything goes wrong in the deployment of a stack, if it runs into an error, it will undo all the things that it has done and return back to the original start state when you started the deployment. And this is global too. Two people can't deploy to the same CDK stack at the same time. Only one person can be the driver. And so once you start a deployment, the system is effectively locked down until it completes all the way back. I've seen cases where we had a value that was typed into Lambda wrong. We deployed it, and sure enough, it didn't deploy it, but it rolled back to the prior state, so there's no change to the AWS account. Fix the bug, and then deploy again, and it works. That's a pretty handy feature to basically have a safety net under provisioning. So this is deployed, so we can actually go ahead and kind of create a stack. And I don't know what the AI is doing, but hold on. So what I like to do is to write my comments first, and then you hit tab and it just provisions you whatever. So we've got an S3 bucket. What we don't have is, so I just hit tab and it's saved. And so now I have a bucket called empty bucket. And I'll put a prefix on it. So leading edge web empty bucket, okay? And I'll also want to do PW empty S3 bucket. There we go. And then I can simply run deploy again, and it's going to identify that we have delta, that we didn't have an S3 bucket there before. And it'll actually go ahead and provision it. While we wait for deployments, any questions? Silence.
Is your service gonna be down during this loop? Is the service gonna be down during the deployment? I mean, if you have a multi-minute deploy.
It depends on what you're deploying, when, and how you divided up your architecture. So there are cases for deployment that, there are cases in like Docker and Kubernetes where they'll hang on to one node and they'll update all the other nodes, and the last thing they do is kind of sweep the last one. I've seen that pattern quite a bit. But it really depends on the primitives that you're using, and everything will effectively stay live until you deprovision an instance of something. So it's sort of it's an ideal situation if you're billing on a per hour basis for everything in the account. But having been through the process of cleaning up accounts, this is a very handy tool. In a short period of time, if you need to clean out an AWS account, you can clean everything out and move it to a new AWS account just as easy. So CDK deployed to a different stack in parallel or different region, and then basically delete the old, move the DNS, and nobody knew it was down. Okay. Or you can do blue-green. There's lots of strategies for how to kind of work around the deployment. Okay, so we have an S3 market.
Now go ahead.
Check it out.
Yes,
Okay, so we have.
Oh, another question.
Yeah, so we successfully.
Another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Yeah, I had just two questions. One, for the logical names, that you're using the, like that hyphenated sequence for name spacing. I thought that the cloud formation template names, they have to be alphanumeric, I thought. So is the CDK taking care of transforming the name, or am I just forgetting the constraint on the identifiers?
I think it allows for a hyphen. It's alphanum plus hyphen. And there's some that allow underscore, but those are very rare. There's only a handful of services that support underscore naming. But you're kind of best kept to real primitive names. But in the instance name, I always use hyphen, and I always start with a prefix and end with whatever service or whatever thing I'm provisioning.
Yeah, that was just surprising to me to see. And the other thing was, most of the examples for the data stores, you have retention policy keep or don't delete or whatever. Because things like the like default S3 buckets, they're global and names have to be unique. If you redeploy that stack, you'll run into a collision, right? So do you also have an example of like importing existing resources, or is that something that like CDK magics over for you with CloudFormation?
Yeah, so once you've provisioned something, every item that you provision ends up having an errand. And you can get to the errands, I think this one, it's not showing me, but I think it's in the metadata. No, it's definitely in the property. So this errand right here, that URL is globally distinct from your account. And the pattern's kind of weird, but there's a couple missing colons, it's colon limited. But errands are a really handy way to get a reference. You can always take an AWS errand and put it into CDK, get a reference, and then modify the reference. So it does allow for changing and provisioning and modifying things that exist. So that is supported.
I understand that. I was just asking about in the case where you retain the bucket, say you provision that bucket with CloudFormation, you delete the stack, you had retain, which means the bucket continues to exist, so the stack is gone.
Yes.
So when you use CloudFormation again with the same definition, the bucket name will collide, right? So CloudFormation will fail. So that's what I was asking, is CDK doing something magically to take care of importing an existing resource? Or do you also have an example where you're importing a resource to help?
Well, I don't have that, but we have a removal policy of destroy, meaning if I remove this, it'll destroy the bucket. But if I change this to retain, okay, and then hit save, and then what I need to do is run provision again. So it'll modify that bucket to retain. And then I'm gonna go ahead and delete it, and then we'll re-provision it, and it'll run into a collision and it'll basically back out. But when it hits the collision, what it does is it says, this exists, stop, and then unwinds that build of the stack.
Yeah.
So you're always at a good starting point. And if you're not, there's good UI inside of CloudFormation to kind of get you unstuck. There are ways to actually edit CloudFormation stacks directly and put in properties and primitives. And there's also a thing called stack drift, which is if a stack has drifted in value from its reality. So its reality is all the services that it obtains references to. If its definition is modified from that, you've experienced what's called stack drift. And there are tools in the stack drift feature set to allow you to sync and resync and get them correct. So you can kind of have an autocorrect inside the stack, inside of CloudFormation to kind of fix things. Okay, so that deployed. And I think your question was if we just comment this out.
It wasn't commenting it out. I thought I misremembered. I thought that you had retain on the bucket because I thought you'd mentioned retaining resources while you're talking to.
Well, I just provisioned, I updated that S3 bucket to now be retained. And now by removing the code, commenting out and running the stack, I am effectively deleting the S3 bucket from the stack. It's gone. But in reality, that bucket will still exist. And if I go back into the account and there's still a view empty bucket. And if I come over, I keep opening code when I intend to open Windsurf, the icons are. So I'm gonna undo that, it's exactly the way it was before. If I run this, it'll try to create a bucket, and it's really gonna collide on the bucket name. If you don't put the bucket name in, it'll just randomly pick wild bucket names and give you back these long URLs. And those are always distinct, unique, it never fails. It's only when we try to name things that we usually mess them up. So create failed, there's already a bucket there. I get an issue and it tells me rollback complete. So we actually hit a thing that we provisioned exists, and we can't undo it because it has retain on the deletion policy. So you can set up pretty interesting structures inside of your AWS account to prevent things from somebody just running scripts and doing stuff on accounts. So let's look at some of the other ones. So that was empty, but I'm gonna do this web backend one, it's a little interesting and relevant. This one is very short, but I can walk you through what is in it. How about I do this? I'm gonna start deploying it and then we can talk through the code. So CD. Okay, update and npm run deploy. Okay, so that's deploying this stack called web backend. And web backend starts with an HTTP API gateway. So it's effectively an API. It kind of think of it as an Nginx you don't know. AWS is provisioning an Nginx and putting it somewhere. It's going to receive connections. I'm going to give it a URL and give me all the necessary things. And then I'm going to provision a Lambda running Node.js. And this Lambda is actually running this source code, so backend index.ts. It's going to provision it on ARM64, running Node 22 with a gig of memory. Okay. Timeouts at 10 seconds, and I created a log group for it. And then I stitched that Lambda into the API with a wildcard URL, proxy pulse, which means any URL will map into that Lambda as needed. And then it's going to publish out the API URL so that we can see it and hit it. And Corey turned me onto this API, but this is Hono. And Hono is it's JavaScript based server framework. But Hono allows you to write new Hono is the app, and then you put routes in the app and you get back responses. But it has this really nice feature called Hono/AWS Lambda. And what that does is it maps all of the API routes through Lambda locally without having a listener. And so any of the Lambda API calls map directly to Node and get to response, but there's no running server on port. There's no listener. It's actually mapping a really nice web framework into AWS Lambda kind of seamlessly. And so I can pop this open and there it is. We have a URL that I can open and it says, hello, view from Hono. And I can hit this very bizarre randomly typed URL, and it should reply with the exact same thing in path and tell you the path it's hit. So you can write entire services, really nice services, with just a Lambda API. Like I don't know, it's confusing at first, and then once you get used to it, because once the Lambda's hot, it's effectively really fast. So you're getting nice web performance from almost a no-cost server environment. And this is less than $1. This is dollars per month, if that. So the ability to kind of build stuff and deploy it and have it be dynamic, have it use modern tools and modern runtimes, it's all kind of within your reach. And if you wanted to customize the URL or deploy things differently, you can kind of remap this and reprocess it. So for little services and smaller projects, it's a great way to do it. So that's the web stack. And just as easily as we brought it into being, we can simply just do npm run destroy. And it goes away, all of it. So the API gateway, the Lambda, like all of it just will run through and delete everything that was just provisioned. And if you've ever provisioned by hand, seeing this kind of brings you to tears. Like it's a real moment. But yeah, nobody thinks about unprovisioning things. You always think about, yeah, let's get in the console and create this stuff, but it just makes a mess every time. Every time you do hands on keyboards and human edit, it just makes a mess. You want it to be replayable and consistent and kind of hands off. Do a deploy very fast. Gone. So stacks destroyed. The last stack I have for you, and I didn't get around to doing the more advanced one, my apologies. It's called Event Workers. And Event Workers is actually kind of a backend, it's a backend processing platform working off of EventBridge. So anywhere in an AWS account, you can emit an EventBridge event. An EventBridge event has JSON and it's using an open API event format. And that syntax is pretty standard now. It basically has a JSON encoded kind of message, that's the data. That's the detail, and then there's a detail type and another name. But I'll show you how it works. Let's deploy this one. Run deploy. Okay. And on this stack, well, this one starts off by provisioning an event bus. And then it creates two queues, and these queues are tied to one another. So this is the DL queue. So this is the dead letter queue, where I want my failures to go. And I have 1 day retention on the DL queue, but I'll get an alarm. And then on the queue, I will say dead letter queue, I denote it as the dead letter queue. So this one is now referencing this one just by const name. Which is very handy because then it wires it together correctly. And if I receive one, I'm gonna process a message one time, and if I get an error of any sort, I'm gonna put it in this queue. Okay, so a message comes into this queue. If the handler for it errors, that message will arrive in here, and then I can replay it once I fix my bug in my logic that's processing that queue. Pretty handy little pattern. And what we're going to do is create an event rule. And this event rule says that anytime a source of EW comes to, and the detail type is EW, hello, Brian, Corey, or Ted, those messages, if those come across the bus, it's going to put a message into the queue. So we're now wiring things up more architecturally. I've provisioned two queues, and now I have an event rule that's going to say whenever a message comes into the bus that matches this pattern, it's going to put it in this queue. And then we're going to need to process that. So we're going to actually need some codes. We're going to get the code from assets. In this case, we're actually going to have a bundling image, and we're going to use Python 3.13. And then we'll just run requirements on it, and we'll basically build up a Docker image to then deploy. And then on the SQS worker, it's just a Lambda function. And this is real simple format, but Python architecture ARM64, and it's going to call index.handler, index.py, and then the handler method within it. And then your standard definitions and a custom log group. And then to make the Lambda get the messages, we need to subscribe the Lambda to an event source, which is the SQS queue. So you've now mapped, anytime a message comes into the original SQS queue, the Lambda is going to trigger, process the message. If it fails, it will automatically put it in the DL queue. And so now you have this pretty rich event architecture. And then we'll output the event bus name. And it is created. And to do this, I need some details from here, but since Brian's in the room, he's going to be the victim of an event. And so we could go into the AWS account. If you haven't used EventBridge, it's really addictive. It's like the no-brainer simple event bridge or event bus. And so event buses, we have an event bus, EW event bus. And I'm gonna send it some events. Our source needs to be EW. The detail type needs to be that. And let's say message. And this is just JSON. Hello. From dead. So you can have data passed with your event in arbitrary JSON. The bus is super fast. EventBridge is really quite amazing for what you actually get. I mean, I've seen it process into the high multi-thousands per second. It's crazy fast. And by some metrics, that's slow. I get it. So I published this event. And so the message went to EventBridge. EventBridge put it in the SQS queue. And then a Lambda processed that message. And we can go take a look at the CloudWatch logs to see what so CloudWatch, if I go to log groups and I go to the worker log group, there is a record. And in that record, hello Brian was executed and message was hello from Ted. So you get logging, you get almost free event processing, and you have both an event bus and a queue, and on failure, you can retry those messages. So if a message is failing or accumulating, you can simply fix the code and then actually take the DL queue and say DL queue redrive, and it'll push all the messages back into the original queue and process them all out. So you don't lose anything. Anyway, so that's the kind of 3 stacks, and thank you.
Awesome. I'll ask you a question and we'll have some more, but
Yes.
this is very much outside of my world, but I'm really interested in like scale on this. Like where would this, I guess, this might be a weird way to ask it, but like where would this stop being useful in terms of like size of a company or size of an architecture? Is this something, you know, smaller companies and startups, or like, I mean, we're sitting here at Expedia that has 10,000 engineers and entire platform teams and all that. Where could this be used along that spectrum?
Netflix has a 16 petabyte DynamoDB instance that runs all of its movies and custom user data. And it was provisioned with the TypeScript that I showed on the screen. Provisioning a DynamoDB table is the same for me as it is for Exxon, as it is for Netflix. And so these accounts are extraordinarily powerful. You're starting with a very high level of scale and support. And I know serverless has its nuances. In terms of you have to get used to the environment evaporating in the middle of a request. That happens. So like if you run too long, it will literally destroy the environment upon which you're executing and stop execution midway on the script. So under those constraints, right, that's not a perfect world. You have to be very careful with what you're doing. It's those types of barriers that are more the limitation. I mean, the S3 bucket will scale infinitely. The DynamoDB bucket, like databases, will scale infinitely. Postgres and Aurora, you're really limited by how much capacity you put behind it, but you know, you can run very, very large instances in AWS Aurora.
Yeah, but the CDK itself, like this is something that a platform team could choose
Yes,
to adopt. I mean, so really at that point, it's more of like decision-making, like inside of a company of who's doing what, and this is a tool they could use to do this.
Yeah.
But maybe just compare, you mentioned Terraform. So like this would replace, or like how do they sort of fit together?
so the question is, how would they fit together? Well, they're great tools. I can't say anything negative about Terraform compared to CDK. It's just a different tool. But the tool in this case is being made by the vendor who wants you to use their APIs. And so they're very good about keeping the docs updated and the constructs accurate, and the capabilities are there to build businesses on. So I've banked my job and my career a couple times on this. And it's been a very solid experience. Like I don't have any regrets about going down this particular path.
So one final follow-up, which
Yeah.
is, like, where do you see this in terms of Amazon? Since you mentioned Amazon made this, like, is there, I wonder what percentage of their traffic and such has this as a part of the flow, and if that's growing?
That I just have no idea. Just don't have any sense of how many people are using it, but it's very easy to provision it into an account. It's very easy to build automation around it. It's very easy to build very dynamic, very complex deploys with it, both updating infrastructure and deploying code. So, I mean, it can just as easily grab a folder on my disk and run a build script and deploy that to an S3 bucket. You get into the difference of what is development, what is provisioning, like making the stuff, and then what is deployment on what's provisioned. This creates a very blurry line amongst all of it. Because in ours, we run in GitHub Actions, we would run a container build, and then we would validate the environment is correct. We just run this to validate that everything looks correct, even though it's the same code we know is there. It would just gives us validation that everything's correct, and then we would end up deploying to it. And the performance is relatively straightforward. Like we've seen 3 deploys, probably 4 or 5 deploys while I was just up here.
Thank you.
Hopefully that's happening in GitHub Actions or some sort of managed CI/CD environment. So, but that's it. But thank you. This was great, fun talking to you.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again. We actually had a few people online on the Zoom, so thanks for joining virtually. And for those in the room, part of the benefit of showing up in person is actually to say hi to another human. So if I don't know you, haven't met you, please stop by and just say hi. I'd love to meet everyone here before you leave. We can hang out for a few minutes and chat before we have to get out of here. So thanks for coming out. Hope to see you again.
Yeah, and I'll take over real quick. And you can leave whenever you want. The elevator will take you down. You don't need a badge to the first floor. And then when you leave, you can either go through the security, which is real close right there, or you can go back to the front door. Either way, you're all good once you leave this room.